My name's Cindy Brown, and for the social movement presentation video that I wanted to touch on today, I wanted to talk about the labor movement. So, what is the labor movement? Let's go over the background. The labor movement was a social and politically charged movement that aimed at improving the conditions of workers. This movement began during the Industrial Revolution, and workers part of this movement were fighting for issues such as child labor, low wages, long hours, unsafe working conditions, and the absence of basic human rights benefits. Now, to understand why this movement started during the Industrial Revolution, we have to understand what the Industrial Revolution is. So, the background of the Industrial Revolution. Basically, this revolution started during the 1800s, and it was a super rapid urbanization and industrialization into small towns, kind of turning them into cities. And this was because new technologies kind of started booming all across the nation. Things like the spinning jenny were invented, which was basically like sewing, but you could put multiple spools of thread on one thing and it spun around instead of doing the whole like needle and thread thing. The steam engine was invented, the typewriter was invented, and mills were invented also. Because of all these new technologies and inventions, there was a lot of factories coming up really, really fast. So this is what contributed to the rapid industrialization of small towns. These small towns were turning into cities with these factories being built, and people couldn't keep up. They had everybody working in these factories. You could have been born like a month ago, and they probably would have sent you to work. They had children working there, men working there, women working there, really hard, long hours of labor for super, super little pay. And this is what started the whole labor movement. Now, moving on. So we want to know what were the goals of this movement. So basically, people were fighting for fair wages. They wanted reasonable working hours because during the labor movement and the Industrial Revolution, they had people working 12, 14, 16-hour shifts every single day, 7 days a week, nonstop. They also wanted the right to unionize. They wanted the right for their voice to be heard. We wanted to end child labor. There's no reason that a 6-year-old should be driving like I don't know, a tractor in the factory barefoot, you know? And they also wanted regular job security and benefits. Now, let's talk about the coalitions of this movement, the people who work together, allies, etc. So, a lot of people ended up working together to make real change during this movement. It started with local union groups and cities that were coming together and, doing strikes, protests, all of that. And then this got picked up quickly. A lot of national and international groups, they all joined together to protest the unsafe and unfair working conditions brought to you by the Industrial Revolution. This became big, and some of the union groups that organized include the 1827 Mechanics Union of Trade Associations in Philadelphia, as well as our first international group, which was the 1852 International Typographical Union between the United States and between Canada. So basically, this created the American Trade Unionism, where people in North America, they were all unionizing together to get rid of these unsafe working conditions. Everyone was working together. This is internationally now. We're going between countries, and everybody just wants safe working conditions. So, not only were labor unions formed during this and for labor unions working together, also different equal rights advocates were coming together with these unions to all fight for the same cause. So, this created the National Labor Union in 1866, and also kind of a primary like leadership fighting group during this time was the Knights of Labor that was in the 1880s. Let's talk about tactics, persuasion, and rhetoric during this movement. So, tactics of the labor movement included going on strikes and boycotts as well. Workers were going on strikes, they were not doing the work, they were not producing what needed to be produced. They did this all just for a demand and change of the workplace. Boycotts also happened during this time. People were refusing to buy from these factories and from places that made these different things. Oh, excuse me, and the consumers weren't consuming. So the producers weren't producing, the consumers weren't consuming. We were all kind of at a standstill. Also, with this, groups were hosting organized sit-ins as well as non-violent, peaceful protests. People were doing sit-ins at their workplaces as well as protesting in the street. They had signs, they had speakers, all things like that. Now, going into persuasion and rhetoric of the movement. So, a big persuasion used during this movement that I feel has been used across all movements that we've touched on, and just all movements in general, is pathos, the appeal to emotion. People want to tug at other people's heartstrings to make them, persuade them into thinking how they think or making a change that they want to make, things like that. So, examples of pathos used during this movement, workers were coming and they were speaking up about their own stories that happened during this movement. There was no windows in these factories. There was no sunlight. People were in there for 12, 14, 16 hours a day, breathing in horrible chemicals, breathing in horrible air pollution. People were speaking up about how sick they were getting, the fatigue they were experiencing, physical injuries. People were losing fingers. They were breaking bones. Children were in there barefoot, stepping on all kinds of things. There was a lot of stories that people were able to tell to pull at the heartstrings of just like your common everyday person. Another persuasion and rhetoric used during this was moral framing. People wanted to appeal, to the moral aspects of things, to people's humanity. They wanted people to be like, this is so morally wrong, something needs to change. So during these protests, a lot of words that were used over and over were words like justice, humanity, morality, equality, etc. Now, another thing used during this movement were catchy slogans. So back then, there was no social media. You couldn't tweet a 30-minute long speech and have millions of people watch it, retweet it, comment about it, post about it, remember it, things like that. So if you went during the 1800s in like New York and said a big 30-minute speech, I don't think too many people would recall exactly what you said. So a lot of catchy slogans were made to get the message across and also to get the message to stick in somebody's head. I have some of the slogans here that I put down. An injury to one is an injury to all. Basically saying, like, in the workforce, if I'm injured, you're injured, they're injured, we're all injured. This is unsafe for everybody. Another one, workers of the world unite. So as I mentioned a couple slides back, I believe that there was international groups even forming together between US, Canada, Mexico, North America, things like that, about these unsafe working conditions. Like workers all over the world were literally coming together and working together to stop the unsafe working conditions because of the Industrial Revolution. We also have Solidarity Forever. And then I think this one is my favorite because it really shaped like the modern workday that we know today. 8 hours for work, 8 hours for rest, 8 hours for what we will. So we all know the 8 hours for work and the 8 hours for rest. 8 hours for work is your 8 hour shift, and then 8 hours for rest is your 8 hours of sleep. And then we have 8 hours for what we will. So that's whatever you want to do in your leisure time. If you want to go to the pool, you can go to the pool. If you want to go to the gym, go to the gym. It's your time, it's your 8 hours. You need to do whatever you need to do. You don't need to be holed up in a dark factory for 16 hours a day making nothing, you know? Okay, so now moving on to movement success. The labor movement was able to bring about successful change for workers. Many laws were put into place to protect these workers as well as stop child labor. The right to unionize, work breaks, fair and humane working wages, etc., were all brought about through this movement. So let's get into working wages. So I was actually looking it up because I really wanted to know. I knew that the wages were slim, but I wanted to know how slim. Based on what I was able to find, they used to get paid in something called shillings, which is not like US dollars, but basically doing more research from what I found, it's like set 0.70 of a US dollar. So basically 70 cents. So men at most could make up to 40 shillings a week. Not a day, a week. Women, the most they were able to make was anywhere between 10 to 25 shillings. And children, little children, the most they were able to make was 2 to 5 shillings a week. That is horrible. That is so horrible. But anyway, other things that came into place, specific acts and laws, we have the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938. This raised the minimum wage. This also fought overtime. If you worked more than this 8 hour shift, you were paid more because this is now overtime. You were not supposed to still be at work. And it also put an end to child labor and put in specific parental guidelines, parental consent, all this other stuff that has to do with the child under the age of 18 working. We also have the Wagner Act of 1935, which was the workers' right to unionize. Before this, you really did not have an opinion. You were there, you had to be there, and you had to suck it up. Now you're able to have an opinion, you're able to form a group, you're able to have these opinions together, you're able to report something if you don't like it to a higher up manager, things like that, etc. So we all know OSHA, the OSHA. What OSHA stands for, it's Occupational Safety and Health Act, and it's basically just general workplace safety. Instead of in a dark factory, well, we're going to throw some windows here and there. We're going to throw AC vents in there. We're going to throw light switches in there. We're going to not make you work barefoot, things like that. So it's basically a general workplace safety act. And also, what I think is the most important is it created the work-life balance that we all know and tolerate today. I would not say know and love, but I would definitely say tolerate. So what I was talking about, oops, right here where I said 8 hours for work, 8 hours for rest, 8 hours for what we will. I think that's the most important in creating what we know about working conditions today because it's standard. It's what we know. We know the 8 hour shift, we know our 8 hours of sleep, and we know with the time that we have to do what we need to do. This created a work-life balance, 8 hour work days, and who knows like how long we would be working and what our hours and conditions would be if the labor movement never happened. So, yeah, thank you.